Chapter 20. As the drones came closer, Paul noticed that there were some small, spider-like creatures lying motionless on the floor of the cavern. They had long, spiny tails like the drones, but there the resemblance ended. His parents crowded around him, ready to be taken first. Rebecca was crying softly, the desolate sound almost lost in the drone's hissing anticipation. Amish Johansson was snatched up by the nearest drone. He shouted, terrified, as the drone extended its inner mandibles slowly and brushed the deadly apparatus against Johansson's stubbled cheek. The malignant creature hissed and dropped him roughly back to the ground. It then reached out slowly, talons extended, and grabbed a handful of the crewman's hair. It yanked, suddenly, the hair coming away in a clump. Johansson put a hand on his bleeding scalp and backed away, confusion competing with terror across his homely features. The drone studied the uprooted handful, then dropped it, tilting its head to one side as the hair drifted to the sticky floor. What? Paul didn't have time to complete the thought. Another drone stepped forward and pulled him from between his clutching, wailing parents. He screamed, knew it was over. He would die first. The drone stuck one sharp, reeking claw into his open mouth and probed at his tongue. Paul gagged and tried to back away, but the creature gripped the back of his head patiently and continued to probe. The horrible stink of the place had almost been enough, but now Paul couldn't stop himself. He vomited, great heaves of half-digested food and bile spewing out over the drone's fingers and onto the floor. The alien tilted its head to one side, released him, and then ran its vomit-drenched hand across its glistening teeth. It hissed and backed away. One by one, the drones came forward, touching the humans, probing them, sniffing, pulling at clothes, their behavior unheard of by Paul or any of the others. They were being examined by the nightmares, and somehow it was more frightening than the prospect of death, poked and pried at by the grinning, stinking monsters in their fetid nest. "Rebecca!" Paul spun at the sound of Quentin Clark's shrill scream, saw him struggle desperately to free himself from a drone's tight grasp. Rebecca's mother was curled up on the floor, unconscious. Two of the creatures had her, seemed to be fighting over her. One had her by the arms and was growling, a low, menacing rattle. The other one had Rebecca's legs and was pulling, its desperate shrieks blending with Rebecca's, except hers were in terror, and then in pain. Judith ran forward, her program finally activated. She jumped in between them, snatched at the pulling drone's claw. A terrible rending sound, muscle and bone torn apart. The drones fell backward amid Rebecca's dying screams. Blood spurted from the socket of the girl's hip where her leg had been, spouted and then gushed as her cries faltered, as her heart stopped. Everyone was screaming then. Lucian Church clutching her son, praying, sobbing, Louise awake now, she and her husband both fighting to get to their daughter. Judith was grabbed by one of the watching drones, held, and then beaten with Rebecca's dismembered leg, pounded with the limb by the alien she had tried to stop. Judith wasn't built to withstand so much. Her milky fluids spattered, mixed with the blood from Rebecca Clark's torn flesh. She crumbled, arms still flailing, until the drone that held her ripped them off and tossed them carelessly aside. "Get back! Everyone get back!" Taylor screamed and held up his fist, suddenly dark and over-large. A grenade taken from the ship's stores. Paul watched on helplessly, sick with dread and loss as Taylor hurled himself forward towards the largest group of screaming drones. Watched until he was yanked down by his father, pulled to the bloody ground, and shielded by Jason Church's trembling body. An explosion, his father's flinch, the blast blotting out the alien screams for only a second. Paul pleading to whatever god existed to make it count, to kill them all. Church smiled sadly. He only took out 2 of the drones, a token protest really. He shook his head, remembered the crewman's gravelly voice, his strong, blunt presence. Taylor. God, how that man loved his cigars. A tangent. Church sighed, reluctantly let the memory go, and then went on. After that, they moved quickly. We were separated, and I was forced into the deepest bowels of the hive. On the way, I saw what had happened to the crew of the other ship. Paul stopped struggling when he realized that it didn't make a difference. He was using all his strength up, and the drone that clutched him wasn't fazed, still carried him along without effort through the dim, foul passages. He let the drone pull him along, and searched desperately for some mode of escape. If there was one, he didn't see it. The nest was solid, the dark alien secretion sturdy and seamless. Although his nose was plugged, running with mucus from his crying, he could still smell the vile air, the rotten, decayed stink of the place, and now, as they darted down another passage, some part of the rancid scent grew stronger. Once, his family had uncovered a smuggler's body on one of their scheduled stops, a sexless, half-buried corpse that had died from a bullet in its back, undoubtedly from a greedy shipmate's gun. The smuggler had perhaps been dead for months, and the stink had been awful, vicious and rank. This new smell was familiar and similar, but multiplied 1,000-fold. Paul stared around dully through tear-swollen eyes, but could see no corpses, no human. A dripping sound overhead. Paul looked up, knowing already what he would see, trying and failing to steel himself against the sight. There were at least a dozen human beings hung from the ceiling, their bodies naked and bloated, mouths gaping open in silent screams. Men and women, faces and limbs strung together with the alien webbing, woven into a grotesque living tapestry of mutilation, but only partly living. The stink was from those who had died, their corpses putrefying into malodorous liquid flesh that spattered softly to the ground. Incubators. This is what happens, what will happen to us. The drone carried him past, the dangling limbs of the human incubators brushing against his hair with cold, dead fingers. He was taken to a bare place against the back wall, pushed up against it roughly. A pool of greenish-grey liquid was nearby, the opaque slime teeming with tiny tadpole creatures, but Paul didn't even hazard a guess as to what they were for. He could only stare at the hanging forest of flesh and try not to see it. He was beyond guessing, beyond anything but a dull numbness. He was attached to the wall with thick strands of web-like secretion, his arms strung over his head, one leg up and the other half on the ground. The drone cluttered, a low clucking sound, then turned and left him there to contemplate his fate. Hours passed, the only sound there that of the slow dripping in front of him and the occasional unconscious moan from one of the dying incubators. Hours and hours and hours. The dim light faded, went away, came back. Paul screamed for a while, then slept, then awoke to scream again, but nothing changed. Sometimes, from far away, he heard other screams, distant human voices begging and sobbing, but they never lasted very long. He wasn't sure if he cared, but thought that he had at some point before his eyes and nose had been scoured by the hideous stench, before that girl had been ripped to pieces, before he was shown what he was to become. When they finally appeared, he wasn't sure how he felt about it. Two dark shapes loped forward, past the hanging vines, straight at him. He eyed them suspiciously, tried to think. They've come to kill you now. Paul smiled, then laughed, welcoming the creatures in a voice that was high and unknown to him. He was going to die. It was... He searched through the darkness of his mind for the symbols, the words that it was. It was a miracle. That was it. He thanked them as best he could, nodding and babbling sounds that seemed familiar to some part of him. He would be free from this place, free to rest his aching eyes, to sleep and never have to dream. He was wrong. They had come to feed me, he said quietly. One of the drones buried its face into a hanging corpse, then came to me and covered my mouth with its own, forcing the rotten flesh down my throat. They wanted me alive, at least for a while. The feeding was interrupted by a scream, the worst sound I've ever heard before or since. It was human, but only because it came from a human body. Whatever had made Quentin Clark a human was irretrievably gone. Another drone brought him into the chamber, and he screamed on and on, blood on his lips from his shredded vocal cords. He was quite insane, you see, driven mad by whatever horrors he'd endured in that stinking hell. One of his arms was half gone, a scrap of cloth tied above his elbow as a makeshift tourniquet. And there was a huge, ragged hole in the crotch of his pants, the tatters remaining stained with blood and bits of flesh. He didn't stop screaming when they pushed him into that pool of green liquid, forcing him to drink. He continued to scream as they glued his head to the wall, and then screamed after they left him, on and on, hour after hour, until he only made a horrible gobbling sound like a goose. It was about then that I started trying to swallow my own tongue. Church paused, smiled wryly at the pale, mute faces of his audience. As you've surely guessed, I didn't succeed. I don't know why I was kept alive, or why I was separated from the others. Perhaps they were also isolated and I was just the last in line for whatever they wanted of us. I honestly never understood why, and probably never will. I survived because I had no alternative. Although for a while after that I lost my grip on reality. I'm not sure for how long. Days, I suppose. Ultimately, my mind simply retreated into itself. Movement, and a sudden sharp pain joined by another, then too many to count. He moaned, felt his body jostled roughly by bony fingers, his numb limbs abruptly alive and screaming with needles of agony. Eyes open from the pain. Before him, a man in a scummy pond of fluid, swollen and dead. He frowned, knew something about the man. He stopped screaming. He finally stopped screaming. "Clark," he rasped, but wasn't sure what that meant. The thing that held him didn't answer, but dragged him away and through an indefinite darkness. Time and movement, and an opening of space. He was put down, landed, and crumpled to a sticky floor. New place, new sounds. Sucking, slurking noises. Soft, wet meat noises. Something clicked inside. Paul raised his head wearily, blinking. He'd been dreaming for a long time. Something about a ship and Quentin Clark shouting. Screaming, and he wouldn't stop. That wasn't a dream. Consciousness, and Paul didn't like it, didn't want it, but he remembered everything now. He must have blacked out for a time, but the drones had come back, taken him down from the wall, taken him... Paul looked around, saw the strange egg-like orbs all around him in the high-walled room. He crawled, stumbled to his feet, saw the lithe black figures crouching nearby, watching a struggling human figure. The person, woman, impossibly bloated, her hands secured to the floor, her movements weak, and her form racked with pain. He was in their breeding pen, and Louise Clark was about to give birth.